Welcome to the deep dive. We're here again, ready to really get into the ideas you've been sending our way.
And there's definitely a theme emerging lately, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely. A lot about silence, that feeling, of speaking up, but still feeling unheard, or that knot in your throat people mention.
Mm-hmm. That feeling of being overshadowed, or maybe your words just don't land how you intended. It's pretty common.
Exactly. You've described feeling like, okay, you said your piece, but somehow you still feel like an easy target afterwards.
Yeah.
So that leads us to the big question for today, really sparked by your input and also some, fascinating material referencing Friedrich Nietzsche. Is silence just nothing? A sign you're overwhelmed?
Or could it be something else entirely? Maybe a form of power, a tool even.
Right. And these ideas connected to Nietzsche's Übermensch, the overman that came up in the material, they offer a really provocative way to look at it.
It definitely challenges how we normally think about strength, about influence in conversations.
So that's our mission for this deep dive, to understand how silence can be this active force, and maybe, more importantly, how you can start using it differently. Move away from feeling vulnerable.
Okay, let's do it.
So first off, the source material really pushes back against that common idea, doesn't it? That you have to keep talking, defending, correcting things to be heard or to win.
It flips it completely. It says, true power has never been in words, but in their absence. That's quite a statement.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it connects to Nietzsche's idea, or the interpretation of it, that people who talk constantly actually reveal too much.
Right, like that very need to keep convincing, that itself can be a weakness.
Yeah. Why is that, though? Why is revealing too much seen as a disadvantage here?
Well, the more you say, the more you expose maybe your own doubts, your strategy, your potential weak spots. The text suggests silence itself can become this overwhelming presence.
Overwhelming? How so?
It disconcerts others. It destabilizes them because they don't know what you're thinking. It's like this void they can't quite pin down.
Which is so counterintuitive, right? We're usually told to speak up, make ourselves known, fill the quiet.
Exactly. But this perspective suggests the most powerful presence might actually be a silent one sometimes.
Okay, so this connects to the ego then. The source talks quite a bit about why we feel this need to jump in and respond, to prove ourselves.
Absolutely. It argues that urge, that need to justify ourselves all the time, it often comes from a fear of looking weak or inadequate.
And underneath that fear,
often a fragile ego, as the text puts it. Something that takes any challenge, any disagreement, really personally.
And the Nietzschean angle presented here is that a lot of arguments aren't really about finding truth anyway.
No, it suggests they're often more about power plays, about asserting dominance, or just, making sure your own beliefs feel secure. It's about reinforcing what you already think.
So it's not a genuine exchange?
Not always, according to this view. It can become just a defensive game for the ego. And the key insight the source offers is, the moment you feel absolutely compelled to justify yourself over and over,
you've already lost.
You have already entered their game and lost.
Yeah.
That feeling of needing to defend signals a vulnerability they can latch onto.
Wow. So engaging on those terms is already conceding something. Okay, this leads into another concept from the material. Herd morality. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. Herd morality, as it's framed here, is basically living by the group's expectations. Seeking approval, following the crowd to fit in, to be seen as good.
Right, doing what everyone else does, or what you think they expect.
Exactly. But the source argues that always looking for that external nod, that validation, actually keeps you, weaker.
So if that's the weaker path, according to this view, where does real strength come from?
It comes from the opposite, from not needing to convince everyone. It's about developing your own internal conviction, trusting your own view, your vision.
Even when people push back or criticize.
Especially then. It's about that internal self-assuredness that doesn't crumble just because someone disagrees.
Which sounds like internal mastery. The idea that power comes from staying calm when others are, losing it.
Mm-hmm. And crucially, stopping that immediate need to react to everything thrown your way.
The source calls the reactive mind a subjugated mind.
Yes, exactly. It elevates the observing mind, the one that can step back, see clearly, and not get sucked into the emotional whirlwind. That's positioned as real strength.
Okay, but if you're not constantly reacting or talking, how do you actually have influence? This is where the Übermensch idea comes back in, isn't it?
It is, and it's a pretty big concept. The Übermensch, or overmen, is described as someone who sort of transcends those everyday norms, that herd morality. They create their own values.
And their influence comes from
Deep self-mastery. And according to this text, that self-mastery often shows itself as a kind of powerful silence.
So it's not about winning every little debate or getting tangled in office politics, for example.
No, it suggests they operate differently. They observe, they understand, and they choose very carefully when to speak, but just as importantly, when not to.
And that silence isn't just emptiness.
Far from it. It imposes presence. It carries a weight and authority without needing words.
The text even calls it a threat. That seems really strong for just not talking.
It does, but think about the effect. When someone seems self-possessed, capable, and they choose silence, it makes others uneasy. What are they thinking? What move are they planning?
Okay, so that uncertainty is where the power lies.
Part of it, yes. That deliberate silence can feel like authority, like self-mastery. It hints at a control others might not have.
It builds that wall, as the source describes it, forcing others to kind of question themselves.
Exactly. They might overcompensate, talk too much, reveal their own weak spots because they're trying to fill the void or figure you out.
And this isn't passive, you're saying. It's not just zoning out.
No, definitely not. It's framed as absolute control of one's own energy. A strategic choice about where you put your focus, your words, your reactions. The Übermensch, in this view, knows that wasted words or emotional reactions can be liabilities.
So the silence comes from a place of strength, of choosing not to engage verbally because your presence itself is enough in that moment. Okay, let's talk about why this silence feels so unsettling to people on the receiving end.
Right. The psychological side. The text suggests it acts like a mirror.
A mirror.
Yeah. When you don't immediately fire back or offer your opinion, the other person is left facing their own words, their own arguments, without that external pushback or validation they might expect.
And that makes them uncomfortable because...
Well, the source implies a lot of our talking isn't just pure expression. It's also self-protection, trying to convince ourselves as much as others, maybe hiding uncertainties.
So when you're silent, their disguise falls away.
That's the phrase used, yeah. And the text points out, psychologically, in conflict situations, silence often gets interpreted as judgment, even if you don't mean it that way.
Oh, interesting. So the other person starts filling the silence with their own stuff.
Exactly. They project their fears onto it. Are they judging me? Do they disagree? Did they see through me? It creates this internal spiral.
And this can really throw off people who try to manipulate situations, can't it?
Definitely. Manipulators often rely on getting predictable reactions. It's how they control the dynamic. If you refuse to give them that reaction, if you stay silent and observant,
You break their pattern.
you break their pattern. You take away their control mechanism. They might get flustered, even angry because their usual tools aren't working.
It's like you're refusing to play their game. The source also mentions silence can tap into deeper things for people, unresolved pain.
Yes, it can touch on old wounds, feeling ignored, rejected, but be humiliated in the past. When their words don't seem to land or get the expected response now, it can be really challenging, especially for, say, a more narcissistic ego that needs constant attention.
So it's not just surface level awkwardness. It can actually poke at some quite deep vulnerabilities. Okay, so knowing all this, how can you listening actually use silence strategically? Make it a tool.
Well, the text lays out a few practical steps. The first one is maybe the hardest. Be silent when your will screams for a response.
Oof. Yeah, that immediate gut reaction to defend yourself.
Exactly, resisting that urge.
Yeah.
Because giving in often means you're still being controlled by the other person's provocation. Strategic silence means recognizing you don't have to respond right away.
Okay, what's next?
Observation. Really shift your focus from planning your comeback to just watching, listening intently. Like a hunter is the analogy used.
Hunting for what?
Not just the words, but the pauses, the body language, the hidden meanings, the contradictions, the fears underneath what's being said.
So you gather information before you respond, if you respond at all.
Precisely. So if you do speak, your words are much more targeted, much more effective, because they're based on real understanding, not just reaction.
Then there's time, using the pause deliberately.
Right. Letting that silence hang a bit, it creates tension, discomfort. It often makes the other person rush to fill the gap.
And maybe say more than they meant to.
Exactly. Or they start making assumptions about your silence, getting tangled in their own projections. Sometimes just a pause, maybe with direct eye contact, can shift things more than a long speech.
And the fourth element?
Unpredictability. When you master silence, people don't know how you'll react. Will you respond? Will you stay quiet? Will you challenge them later?
That makes them more cautious around you.
It can, yes. They might measure their own words more carefully. You become, as the text says, the gravitational center, not by being loud, but by being controlled and observant.
And the point isn't just to be silent forever.
No, not at all. It's about using silence to set the stage. So when you do speak, your words land with real weight, maybe even concluding the matter, because they come from that place of observation and control.
Okay, this is powerful stuff. But the source also warns about the other side of silence, doesn't it? When it's not strategic.
Yes, absolutely crucial point. It talks about the silence that isn't chosen power, but more like a silent scream. The silence of feeling powerless, of having lost control.
And it questions that idea that just always avoiding conflict, always being quiet, is automatically mature or balanced.
Right. It suggests that can actually be a trap of submission.
What's the danger there in that kind of default passive silence?
Well, it connects to that idea of the morality of slaves again. A value system, the text argues, where people who feel powerless might adopt conformity and self-suppression just to survive or keep the peace.
So you silence yourself, diminish your own needs, just to avoid rocking the boat.
Pretty much. It becomes a kind of self-nullification. You end up letting others define you, shape you, instead of standing in your own truth.
And this is the opposite of the will to power mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Which, again, the text clarifies, isn't about dominating others, but about mastering yourself, regaining your own agency, choosing silence not from fear, but from self-sufficiency. Because you don't need that constant external... Okay.
So we need to replace that silence of submission with what?
With a silence of presence. That's the goal. A silence that's solid, unapologetic, the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need to yell, it's just there.
Which brings us back to embodying that Übermensch ideal in a practical sense.
Right. True silence, in this view, is pure presence. It signals you're shaping your world, not just reacting to it. It's the difference between the silence of someone feeling defeated
and the silence of the warrior who has already won. I remember that line.
Exactly, that deep stillness that comes from inner strength, inner certainty.
So it really asks you, the listener, to think about times you've been silent. Was it out of fear, just wanting things to be quiet, wanting to avoid trouble?
And could you shift the tone of your silence? Make it less about escape, more about, well, that invisible shout of authority, that quiet self-affirmation, knowing your own value is more important than getting everyone else to agree.
So wrapping this up, the core idea is silence isn't empty space. It can be incredibly potent, a form of presence, influence, control.
But only when it's conscious, when it comes from self-awareness, not from fear or resignation.
It's about choosing when to speak, and maybe realizing that sometimes the strongest move is to say nothing at all.
Making that conscious choice.
So as you go about your day, your conversations, think about your relationship with silence, can you shift it? Move from maybe being passive to being more active, more strategic.
Yeah.
And here's that final thought from the source to leave you with. The weak shout, the strong remain silent, the wise choose when. Something to consider. When will you choose silence as an act of power?
A great question to reflect on.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.